wszystkich Państwa bardzo serdecznie na kolejnym wykładzie otwartym organizowanym przez Katedrę do Badań nad Przekładem i Komunikacją Międzykulturową. Wykłady, tak najogólniej rzecz biorąc, poświęcone są teorii i praktyce przekładu. To jest kolejny wykład w tym semestrze, będą też następne. Jeżeli Państwo zostaną jeszcze po wykładzie, to pokażę Państwu slajdy, jakie następne wykłady planujemy do końca roku akademickiego. A teraz już witam naszego gościa, wykładowczynię, panią profesor Marię Piotrowską. Pani profesor jest pracownikiem Katedry do Badań nad Przekładem i Komunikacją Międzykulturową na Uniwersytecie Jagiellońskim, ale także jest kierownikiem Katedry Dydaktyki Przekładu na Uniwersytecie Pedagogicznym. Jest pracownikiem i jest kierownikiem. I żeby nie przedłużać, zaczynamy wykład i oddaję mikrofon pani profesor.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Ideas do not come out of thin air. My ideas haven't come out either. And one of those ideas is the idea of a palimpsest, which I would like to focus on briefly. Before I do that, I would like to dedicate this lecture to late Chandler Hervey, a great linguist, anthropologist, teacher, friend, and inspiration, whose untimely death in 1997 stopped his thinking translation. I will come back to that later. So the idea of a palimpsest. To dwell on the idea for a moment, let's have some details. The inspiration comes from an exhibition. It's both a title of the exhibition and a piece of work, a piece of art that you've just seen by Grzegorz Bienias, a Krakowian artist whose exhibition is held at Miasto Sztuki, and the painting is made in the technique of acrylic, oil, pencil and collage. And this last idea, namely the technical component of collage, is of particular interest to me. And to further explain why I start with something as strange as a palimpsest, let me just give you a brief context for the meaning of this painting technique. A palimpsest is an ancient or medieval parchment, manuscript or book from which the original text has been scraped off. It's a record deprived of the visual recognizability of the basic version, a record made on the removed original record. The term palimpsest also means an ambiguous statement of multi-layered semantics. Reference is given. It's a quotation from an introduction to the catalogue at the exhibition. And I'm particularly intrigued by ambiguity encoded in palimpsest making, but also in the fact that in palimpsest, as in translation, we are focused on what is visible, what is stated, but also what is invisible and only implied, unstated, unclear, mysterious, or hardly decipherable. That's by way of introductory explanation. Here is the proper title of what I'm going to talk about today. Translation Inspirations We Live By. And that's more or less it. That's the idea that I would like to convey to you today. The idea that has been built on the grounds of years-long experience in doing translation, also in teaching translation and studying it. Scholarly interests go hand in hand with the practical activity of translation. And all of that builds something like a mental landscape that we might be interested in investigating. to begin with, we are going to play with data a little bit. The presentation is organized along the framework of few reflections, 7 to be precise, and those reflections center around some ideas that I find relevant, useful, and constructive in building the translation landscape. So let's start with reflection 1, which is focus on data. And as we all know, I don't think it's a great revelation to hear that in translation studies there is great abundance and versatility of translation data. And this boils down to identifying corpora that we work with and work on. We may be talking about anything from literary excerpts, comparative analyses of literary texts, to electronic corpora, to eye-tracking studies, to think-aloud protocol studies, to specialized terminology and databases. So the form, the diversity in data collection, their compilation and analysis methods are hugely disparate. And that's the beauty, the advantage of doing research and translation on the one hand, but on the other hand, it's problematic when it comes to any coherence in methodology. And that's quite understandable, and I suppose most of us agree with that. In analyzing research models, the basic introduction was given by Andrew Chesterman in 1997 in his useful and relevant textbook, methodological translation textbook titled The Map, where he mentions those 3 basic translation process research models: comparative, process, and causal. And of course, we are not going into details, and my intention is not to present all those topics that we only briefly refer to, but it's important to realize that the research component in translation studies is highly important and matters. In this presentation, what is happening is really a synergy. It's something like an impressionistic landscape that creates what we might call practice searcher's biography. And of course, I'm referring to the ancient Gilles, not Gilles who is ancient, but his statement that he used some decades ago, and this label of a practice searcher idea has been circulated in translation literature for, as I said, 3 decades almost. So it's the idea that when we do translation, when we do research in translation, we're both translators usually, not always, but it's a typical context, and we do the research, so we're in both functions, so to speak. And because it is meant to be impressionistic and something like of a collection, let me refer to, again, a quotation that stuck with me for 10 years now. I heard those Stuart Campbell's words at his lecture at the University of Manchester in 2005, and I sometimes use it when I explain to students relevance and usefulness of working on corpora in their research projects, such as MA thesis, for example. When we undertake a research project, we develop a complicated relationship with our data. We collect it, check the ethics of using it, manipulate it, store it, share it with others, find new ways to squeeze more knowledge from it, and often worry about it because it is the wrong kind, or there isn't enough of it, or it isn't telling us what we thought it would. Sometimes people even make it up or quietly discard the bits that don't fit. That's dishonesty. Academic dishonesty, to put it bluntly. Getting the relationship right can make a project or break it, and I suppose in each of our individual studies that we do in translation or about translation, That's the whole point, to find a corpus, to find data that would be appealing and that would be motivating, to make the best use of what we are working with. And it's one of those motivational aspects that should be taken into account when we want to investigate translation. To find a niche and find such data that are user-friendly to us, each one of us, individually. And today's landscape is something of a friend to me, or has been for some time. Data in translation is inspired. We can't leave data aside without manipulating it and without organizing it and analyzing it. In approaches to translation, of course, there are very many philosophical paths, epistemological paths that we may take. And I think that one of the important approaches, definitely, is the cognitive approach. And I don't think it would be relevant to even try starting a discussion on the Polish contribution to cognitive linguistics. And everybody can identify the name responsible for translating the ideas, cognitive ideas, on the Polish ground of translation studies. Elżbieta Tabakowska, I suppose, is the name that needs no further mention or explanation. Cognitive influences are very much present in the way we think about translation and we understand the nature of translation nowadays. To focus on just a few cognitive ideas inspiring translation, let me say that cognitive thought in a way underlies the philosophy of continuum. And this philosophy of continuum, in brief, abandoned strict boundaries between rigid categories such as translatable versus untranslatable, good translation versus bad translation, and replace this compartmentalized divisions by gradation and saturation of certain features that are present in translation. And that's why we try to avoid being very straightforward in how we perceive those strict categories when talking about translation. Translation thought is ubiquitous, and that's how we think, those of us who are believers in translation, think about translation. And that's also a certain reflex from cognitive linguistics. Ways of conceptualizing are very important. We wouldn't really be able to understand another point of view without realizing the differences in imagery, the differences in the cognitive framework and mental schemes, those possessed by the original author, translator, and finally recipient of the target text. What we easily observe in discussing translation is a very strong metaphorization of the discourse on translation. In other words, it's very, very noticeable in the Polish discourse of translation. When we talk about translation matters using metaphors, and my allusion to, encoded in the very title of this presentation, is by no means unpurposeful or accidental. Lakoff and Johnson's metaphors are so much present in our cognitive thinking and subsequently in translation thinking to some extent, that I took the liberty of a small transposition here. And in the quotation that I'm using, referring to the sense that metaphors make in our communication and in our perception of the world, I replaced, and it's signaled by capital M, I replaced Lakoff and Johnson's metaphor by my translation lexeme. It is as though the ability to comprehend experience through translation were a sense like seeing or touching or hearing, with translation providing the only ways to perceive and experience much of the world. Translation is as much a part of our functioning as our sense of touch, and as precious. Not much damage has been done to the text by this replacement, I suppose. We can agree or disagree with it, but it's coherent, I think. Cognitive influences have been for a considerable time now part of our intellectual and epistemological experience. Let's move on to the context that is most, that I suppose is the richest and also most inspiring, namely a reflection on culturemes, which brings us to the translation immersion in culture. And I refer here to the idea used in Tabakowska's book O przekładzie na przekładzie, that I suppose all of us have seen and read, 1999 publication. Those cultural capsules refer to individual cultural case studies that Tabakowska focuses on in her book. It's this individual context for a particular translation dilemma that we are faced with that is of interest to us today. And that's my favorite. I don't know if any of you attending perhaps some of my regular lectures can recognize this incident with the Bible, because occasionally I give it as an example to inquiring into culture formative role of translation. Are you more or less? Have you heard of Atahualpa? No? Good. In that case, I can give you a story. We are moving on, or moving back to a place far away, Peru, to a completely remote context, because we are talking of early 16th century, 1532 to be precise. And just one particular incident that happened there. And every time I recall this story, it evokes a whole wealth of associations, and also it gives me a lot of insight into the importance of translation globally, society building role, culture formative role of translation, and also some sad thoughts on human nature too. What I'm talking about is a well-known historical fact of the Spanish conquista in the New World. And of course, I wouldn't be able to rely too much on the original sources. Plus, the original sources talking about this event are biased because they are texts written by the winning party. So this bias is inevitable in some way. And what we're talking about is the encounter between the ruler of the empire, Inca, Atahualpa his name was, and Pizarro with his team of supposedly some 160 soldiers accompanying this group of invaders. And it's really a huge paradox to imagine the situation in which there are differences in sources. Some quote the number of 7,000. Some say there was like 20 or 40,000 Inca soldiers on this square in a city of Cajamarca. And this small group of Spanish conquistadors who in their boldness came to speak to the king, and Atahualpa being in absolute power to do whatever with this tiny group of strangers. He was intrigued by the strangers, and he felt no true danger or no true threat to his rule or his life or the life of his subjects. So he was willing to talk to them and meet them. And if we imagine the whole context, if we imagine situations in which, as some sources say, and let me just quote one, it's an addition to the Polish Rzeczpospolita, that Gazeta Wyborcza, that published relations on historical battles some time ago, and there was a mention that the Spaniards convinced the local people. There is no record of actual case of community interpreting, and we can speculate in some cases. In some other cases, historical sources give us the idea that it was torture and killing that were those methods of convincing the local people to cooperate in some way with the conquistadors. Coming back to the incident with the Bible that inspires a lot of thinking about how translation contributes to civilization growth or may lead to a complete cultural misunderstanding. There are several versions given in the accounts, and according to one of the versions, it happened like that. A Franciscan friar, who was obviously present in the Spanish team, handed in the Bible to Atahualpa, saying that the Bible speaks, and upon subscribing to the biblical message, Atahualpa is to resign his kingdom and become subject of the Spanish king. Atahualpa, of course, the discourse was translated by a local slave interpreter whose name supposedly is Felipe. So we don't really know precisely what was the translation strategy, how the translated text was produced in the target language. What we know is the consequence of the deeds and the fact that Atahualpa, understanding the message literally, took the Bible, put it to his ear, and of course could not hear anything, which led to his discontentment, and ultimately, with disappointment, he threw the book to the ground, which was an insult to the Christian party, and it was a pretext to start the battle and a total massacre of the local population. The number of victims reached several thousand, which in comparison to few Spanish casualties is a huge number, of course. Another version says that it didn't happen like that, not exactly. Atahualpa offered a local holy drink to the Spaniards, and the drink was refused. They were not certain what it was. Maybe it was poison, so they didn't want to drink it. And because it was perceived as an insult, on handing in the Bible, Atahualpa did the same. He refused it, and the whole misunderstanding inspired conflict. And as I'm saying, of course it was a pretext. Probably military moves would occur anyway. However, if we focus on understanding the translation discourse in this particular situation, we might have some idea about how important translation is, has been, always was, and was at that particular moment. Translator's voice is unrecognized. It went silent in many cases. In many such stories, the history of human civilization is full of such stories in which translators of all kinds, interpreters, must have been present, but there are hardly any records of those activities, and some attempts have been made recently to start recording histories of the translation discourse in particular countries, but I suppose it's still not satisfactory, and there is still a lot to do in that area. To mention just a few sources, one of the books by Małgorzata Chrobak, Między światami, tłumacz ustny oraz komunikacja międzykulturowa w literaturze odkrycia i konkwisty Ameryki, talks about that particular cultural background, the encounter of European and Spanish civilizations. The second book, much earlier, Triadic Exchanges, discusses community interpreting in various contexts, contemporary contexts. So it's not a historical book, but it also deals with issues related to this mediation that has happened and does happen on daily basis everywhere in globally and locally. Analyzing culture, of course. Analyzing culture would lead us to 100 new lectures. So I leave you with just this one instance and one insight into how culture formative role of translation is visible in the history. And let's move on to the next capsule or the next reflection. Oh, bless, O Lord, this scriptorium of your servants. Does temporal space give us any understanding of the world? What is the relevance of the physical environment of translators for their work? How do sociological factors influence the translator competence? The beauty of investigating translation lies in the fact that translation actually does penetrate our life. And we may reach the point where everything we do in life can be easily associated with translation. Scriptorium is one of such cases. And accidentally, those of you who may be familiar with an old movie based on the book In the Name of the Rose, from which the idea, for me individually, the idea of the scriptorium, medieval scriptorium, was born, can identify the context, the sociological background, the scene in which those ancient tonsured monks were working on pieces of art, absolutely amazingly beautiful medieval manuscripts. If any one of you has had any occasion to see original manuscripts dated, I don't know, 8th century, 10th century, will probably not resist the temptation to think of those manuscripts as pieces of art. And consequently, so originally the idea of the scriptorium is the place for writing, but consequently it was also the place for translating. And I was wondering, when seeing such ancient manuscripts with translated lines written over the original text, coming back to the palimpsest idea, is there any parallel, or is there any similarity, any link between the work of translators then in those physical environments and the work of the contemporary digital translator? Are we talking about the same competences? Is the nature of the activity really comparable? And I leave you with the questions. I don't know the answer. I'm thinking about it. And there is so much difference that we may risk a statement that perhaps it's something completely different. But on the other hand, comparing what translation activity really is, well, it has remained the same basically in its epistemological foundations. Digital scriptorium, on the other hand, is the idea taken from, I thought of digital scriptorium, and then obviously when I searched it on the internet, it's already there, and it's usually the case with ideas that when you come up with some, it turns out that somebody has already had a similar idea. Digital scriptoria have been or are being produced or are being created nowadays. One of those, and we're talking about digital libraries or digital scriptoria, one of those is Berkeley Library, and we have digital data on daily basis in our translation work. So this transition from analog to digital reality is an interesting observation when you think of it. Moving away from sociological contexts, physical environment in which the translator works, to another dimension, brings us to reflection 5, and one of the crucial ideas, I suppose, that we can encounter in the actual translation practice, namely the idea of strategic translating or decision-making process of the translator. And again, the image of a chess player here is not accidental. It's one of those allusions, and also one of the metaphors, frequent metaphors that we use talking about the translator's decision-making process. Let me refer to a seminal text by Iji Levi in which this metaphor appeared for the first time and has spread since. We may think of translation as an intuitive activity, or on the other hand, we may think that there are phases in the translation process during which we take deliberate decision. And the idea of decision-making, strategic translating, is all based on that assumption. That when we translate, it's not all about illumination, insight, intuition, artistic mental work, if anything like that exists. But part of it may be due to our rational behavior, predicting certain consequences of translation decisions we take, and analyzing the process consciously, focusing on the problems. That area is particularly important in learning the skill of translation. If we believed that translation is only an inborn talent, of course, us sitting at lectures and enrolling at translation courses or translation schools or any form of education would be useless, redundant, unnecessary. Fortunately for the whole educational context, the assumption is that there is something like a skill of translation. So part of what we learn when we try to become translators is learnable, and hence the idea of strategic translating introduces this element of rationale. The model presented in the compensational model for strategy and techniques in teaching translation, which encompasses those strategic elements, was created as a working model for didactic purposes. So the first thought was to have a model that would be functional for learners, for translation students. So the indicators for the model, it's a two-level model. We have the hierarchy and a general, global strategy, which is an approach, the translator's approach to the assignment or task. And again, we understand translation assignment as a larger entity than a translation process or act. And then in line with the strategy, we are talking about techniques and procedures. So strategy is text type oriented, macro goal oriented, contextual, because it refers to the whole text. It's mental, global, because it's planned sequence of actions. On the other hand, technique, which is synonymous with procedure, is problem oriented, so it's local, micro goal oriented, unit focused, physical, and molecular. Such an approach to the understanding of the two terms is in line with some basic translation assumptions presented, for example, by Turi, by Holmes, and other translation scholars. And I suppose nowadays we are used to talking a lot about strategies and procedures, strategic translation. And many translation scholars have approached taxonomies of strategies and techniques with no apparent success, because it's a mission impossible. I don't think we can really come up with any exhaustive taxonomy of translation procedures. On the other hand, we may also refer to an inventory of translation procedures that are applicable in a particular translation case. And that's functional, and that works, I would say. So we are talking about procedures for idiom translation in Emmy Tan's novels rendered from English to Polish, right? So once we provide a contextual framework, such an inventory of procedures may be more realistic. And back to the inspirations. The whole idea of strategic translation, in fact, I think originated in my case in an encounter and some teaching experience with the author of Thinking Translation series, Shandor Hervey. What you can see here, how many of you, if I may ask, are familiar with the textbook? Thinking German, French, Spanish, Italian, or Arabic translation. It's not so widespread, not many. It's not so widespread in Polish, in Poland. In fact, I was quite happy when I managed to get 10 copies of the book for my teaching purposes, something like 20 years ago. Because on the Polish market in early 1990s, translation textbooks were basically non-existent. So having a textbook, a renowned English textbook for translation practical classes was a luxury. And a luxury to be appreciated because, in fact, I think the textbook makes excellent sense. To start with the whole notion, with the title of the book, which is beautiful, and the content of the textbook, in spite of its 20 years on the market, 20-something years on the market. The first version on the French-English pair was published in 1992. In 3 years' time, 2 other language pairs appeared, English-German and English-Spanish. In 2000, it was Italian, and 2002, English-Arabic translation. So in other words, this methodological textbook has the English core and then a lot of exercises based on those particular languages. And the reason why I'm talking about the textbook is that in the contemporary university evaluation systems, textbooks are not appreciated. Whereas I think good textbooks, such as this one, really make sense. They are helpful and they inspire people. They help us understand certain notions and ideas. And the fact that posthumously, few of the versions were prepared with Sándor Hervey not really present with us any longer. But it's still used and it's still being published, means that in spite of those 2 decades, it's up to date and it presents certain ideas and it clarifies translation phenomena in such a way that it allows this textbook to live. To contextualize it a little bit more and to give it a sense, a personal touch in a way, let me refer to the correspondence with the author. 1994, Hervey mentions pedagogy of translation and also the field of translation studies. And the 2 terms are interesting in a way because pedagogy of translation, for example, is quite a new subdivision of translation studies. And the fact that it was already appreciated 2 decades ago signals the awareness and some background knowledge about it. Also, the field of translation studies, as we know, the discipline has struggled with its name for some time, and still in Polish we are not satisfied with certain labels. We use przekładoznawstwo, we use translatoryka, we use translatologia. The field of translation studies, not capitalized as of 1994, outlines the territory that was analyzed and presented by James Holmes in his seminal article towards the end of the 1970s. And 2 indiscreet insights into Hervey's way of thinking. So 2 letter excerpts. Things are not too bad here, 1996, but my workload still seems to keep increasing. At least the work of thinking translation and thinking Spanish translation is finished. Both of these are now in the bookshops. But a colleague from Durham wants to collaborate on thinking Arabic translation, so it seems to have no end. Very nice in a way, but very best wishes for 1996, Sándor. And another, it's undated, but I think it was 1996, a handwritten letter. Thanks very much for your lovely letter and for your manifold invitation. Most gratifying, flattering, and irresistible. And I'm using this quote to give you a touch of Sándor Hervey's enthusiasm for translation, his way of addressing translation issues. He was here in Krakow teaching courses briefly, having lectures and workshops for students at UNESCO Chair for Translation Studies and Pedagogical University, and I had a privilege to co-teach with him during one class. Could do a workshop on aspects of it, perhaps with the title Translating Social Registers, Exercising Freedom or Taking a Liberty. What do you think? For the teacher training college, I might do something practical, say the problems of self-projection in a tourist brochure. Don't we find that still relevant and modern even today? I mean, wouldn't we like to have a subject like that? Problems of self-projection in a tourist brochure, still relevant, I suppose. Where the local organization needs to convey a pleasant image of itself to incoming tourists. We had a very interesting class on this topic about a month or so ago in my course here. And here means St. Andrews University in Scotland. Again, let me know your reactions. Chandler Harvey was an inspiring author, and he was a great teacher who was so eager to share his enthusiasm for translation with his students. And he is becoming history now. Hence, the next reflection that I would like to devote just a moment of consideration to are historical reflections, historical considerations. Strategic thought in diachronic perspective is very complex and multidimensional, and if we wanted to dig into translation and history, we would drown in an ocean of literature, reflection, and thinking. What I would like to do instead is, again, focus on another brief capsule, cultural and translation capsule, namely the case of one particular adaptation on the basis of a historical text coming from 16th century, and you can check, those of you who might be interested in the idea, can check that in Balcerzan's anthology of texts and authors about translation. Górnicki produces a meta-text reflecting on his method of translating, or really adapting, one Italian masterpiece, The Courtier, Il Cortegiano, and he talks about his strategy of Polonization. So he claims that because he was preparing the text for Poles, he used Polish names. And sorry to the listeners who will only be able to appreciate the English language and not the Old Polish version, I will quote anyway. Iż Castillo pisał językiem włoskim, a pisał Włochom, których obyczaje są od naszych daleko różne, przeto nie tylko zaniechałem imion włoskich, a włożyłem polskie, i rozmowę tamtej podobną napisałem. Zgoła niechaj to każdy wie, iżem ja, Polakom pisząc, Polakom folgować chciał. Przeto opuściłem siła rzeczy, które abo nie należały Polszczę, abo rzecz zatrudnić, a poczciwe uszy obrazić mogły. We can reflect on strategic thought in the historical perspective to find out that the strategy of adaptation, functional approach to the text, and taking into account the addressee of the target message were present already in the Polish 16th century translation. We're slowly trying to come to grips with this reality of translation by accommodating all those apparently disparate components together to conclude and to see in the final seventh reflection that there are two phases of translation, in a way, at least two phases, and those two were taken into account today, namely sociological and psychological aspects of translation. It's a trivial statement, and yet so true. On the one hand, we have the scene of translation with its all actors. So we take into account physical environment, we take into account historical events, we take into account cultural embedding and all those factors that build the countryside or the landscape externally. And they are highly relevant. For example, when we are talking about Polish literature translated in the first half post-war period, 50s and 60s in Poland, taking into consideration the communist regime and ideological influences is absolutely inevitable and indispensable if we want to understand certain strategic solutions that translators used. And that's one piece of the story. Another piece of the story is probing into the so-called black box, everybody familiar with that metaphor, and psychology of translation, or psycholinguistic inquiries into the translation process, have been done with think-aloud protocol methods, but also with more recent methodologies, such as, for instance, eye tracking and various forms of analyzing what happens when we translate. Although the whole issue of inquiring into psycholinguistics is rather challenging, also because of technological aspects. And I suppose that's more or less the landscape that has been created with those few scattered images compiled and briefly presented to you today. When we consider what's really important when we teach translation, or when we try to understand translation, when we do research on translation, do we need rules, hints? Do we need error analyses? Do we need suggestions about improvements? Or perhaps we need some inspiration? And because our cognitive and anthropological journey through the translation landscape is almost ended, let me finish by a question that will help us understand that translation really is, translation really gives coherence to our life, if we wish to think that way. Namely, the question, can you imagine the world without translation? Thank you very much. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, you are most welcome to ask them.
Maybe I will be the first one to
Sure.
thank you for this very pretty, thought-provoking and inspiring lecture.
Thank you very much, if I may interrupt. I've never heard such a comment. Pretty lecture. That will be my new inspiration. Thank you.
Pretty thought-provoking lecture.
Okay. No, it's it's Prezi. It's not me.
It's been both pretty for
the
watching,
images.
observing, and for listening to in all the aspects of
Yes, and
listening. I mean, listening to you and listening to all the background that we could listen
and
to.
before I let you ask the question, that's where we are. We've entered the multimodal scene of translation. So we need images, I suppose, for living. Sorry. Okay, I'm ready for your question.
I just wonder if and I love this idea of thinking about translation as a continuum and thinking about type text as a sort of different possible aspects of text continuum. And this of course derives from cognitive psychology and as you said from the work of Eleanor Roche and other cognitive psychologists. I wonder if when we think about translation and interpreting, this is something that that there is some borderline, or there has been some borderline, even among the translation trainers and interpreting trainers. And what you said about the Indians and the Pizarro, for instance, this was obviously a case of interpreting. Right?
Community interpreting.
It was community interpreting. But on the other hand, I thought about translation as sometimes being a means to some other end than communication. What we could see with the Indians, and I thought also about Chinese emperors who, for instance, even if they knew exactly the language of the messengers coming from another country, they employed the community interpreters just to have some extra time to respond. So that was the means to some other end. But I also think about now the advances of technology at the moment, and I think that the new tools such as speech recognition allows us to make the borderline between the translation and interpreting get a bit hazy, a bit blurred. And now I wonder about the different sort of strategies on this horizontal level, this continuum. Do you think that this strategic thinking, these translation strategies could in some way be moved to interpreting strategies? Is there anything like strategic thinking in interpreting, or do you think that this could also be put there? I mean, this discussion, it could also to interpreting.
Thank you very much for your question. In fact, it's a wealth of questions and a lot of problems involved. Let me refer first of all to this cognitive background when it comes to the philosophy of continuum and Mary Snell Hornby's integrated approach to translation studies, where she gives the model in which the boundaries between types of texts are abolished. So that's one thing. Another thing is when it comes to the division and implementation of strategic thinking in the context of the oral modality, it seems quite logical to me as a consequence of certain shifts within translation studies. So we're talking about as if two parameters. One thing is when it comes to actual practical activities of translation. So very down to earth with no pejorative tone level. We need to be very specific, okay? And in that case, the way we implement the strategic process for written texts would be completely different. Oral modality requires different skills, different approach, and needs different strategies and procedures. But I would still think some model of strategic thinking is possible to be implemented. Plus, we know that the whole domain of single-out protocol methodology actually comes from what Shandor Hervey calls in his book genre crossing. The fact that we analyze the process of text writing by means of a dialogue, so oral modality. And single-out protocols, maybe monologue, maybe dialogue, but still it's a mixture of written and oral in the methodology, within the methodology. And so when we are at the activity level, we need separate boxes, somehow separate boxes, because we are doing very practical things, and it's always connected with the language pair and with the mode we're proceeding. However, on the grounds of the recent technological changes, the differences between modalities are no longer rigid. I mean, we can communicate visually, and translation of those visual images would be a different mechanism, but it still may be treated as translation. But it depends on, you know, your viewpoint. To me, everything may be interpreted as translation. So that's my individual bias, which has nothing to do with academic objectivity. However, we objectively observe transitions between genres, and the fact that we have multimodal occurrences of translation, of course, would require some accommodation of theoretical thinking. And what I've noticed in translation literature recently is that at this epistemological level, more abstract and more theoretical level, I think the boundaries between interpreting and written translation that were so strong and valid in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and even at the beginning of this millennium, cease to be so relevant anymore. Does that answer your question? Thank you. Okay. Yes.
Maybe I will take the opportunity. Technological advancement was mentioned, and it will be a Machiavellic question. You asked if we imagine ourselves a world without translation. Could you imagine yourself a world without translators, but with translation?
Yes, it's another symptomatic shift. We have worked on that shift in the area of pedagogy of translation. And the shift is very clear and visible in terminology that we use. So instead of talking about translation competence, we talk about translator competence nowadays. Instead of translation skills, we talk about translator skills. So this human element, which was unrecognized in the past, and that's why we have so many anonymous translators and interpreters. We have so much unrecorded and unregistered translation activity in the history of human civilization. Nowadays, we try to appreciate the person of the translator. And in the technological context, it is difficult, and I see it as like a forked avenue nowadays. On the one hand, we have perfect technological destruction of the humanistic element of translation. Technology is killing the source text, the source author, the evaluation, reception, and globalization acts to the detriment of the appreciation of the beauty of the original and the activity of translation. So that's one thing. Another thing is that, paradoxically, in the framework of scholarly endeavors, awareness, academia understood in abstract, there is a lot going on in the sphere of translation studies as a humanistic discipline, with the figure of the translator foregrounded. We have a lot of subjects, a lot of interest of people in the activity of translation, in the history and culture of translation. So there seems to be, to me, some kind of a paradox here. That on the one hand, it's irrelevant because machines produce a lot. So we have this extreme of machine translation. We have computer-assisted translation. We are all infatuated. Maybe the first stage of that infatuation is already behind us, but we are still very much infatuated by new tools, new computer tools. But on the other hand, we love the essence of translation. We love this individual effort of a person who devotes his or her entire attention to interpretation of a source text. Sorry for this lengthy answer. Mm-hmm.
I totally agree with you in that the whole beauty of translation is that it's human activity and it's made by humans for humans, and that's the beauty of it. And I think that all the translation scholars, when they think about translation, they mostly think about translation being done by humans for humans. So the more the more there is this, tools and computers and other technological advancements, the less there is this human activity. Unfortunately, I mean, this is one of the problems. I totally agree with you. But I also, when you mentioned Górnicki's translation, I thought that some ideas of translation and some strategies of translation have been the same. I mean, this exoticization or foreignization versus domestication, adaptation, that's been the same thing for some time. Do you think that from the diachronic perspective, all the strategies change? I mean, is there any sort of evolution in strategic thinking nowadays?
Let me quote one of my doctoral students who says that in translation, informally, in translation studies we're constantly, all those authors, they are constantly talking about one and the same phenomena, only using different names. And there is something to it. I mean, there are certain threads in translation theories that appeared ages ago and are still valid. And I would say, Cicero's idea. For 2,000 years, we're still considering whether it makes sense for sense translation, or perhaps we should stick to the literal. And literalism as an idea in computer-assisted translation is so important because we are bound by the very structure of the text, which in essence is the nature of literal rendering. So again, it's a complete paradox that in the most innovative approaches, in fact, we are using the most simplistic ideas about how to understand the coherence of text and its structure. On the other hand, at the detail level, the change is inscribed in the translation activity. And I always refer to one case during my teaching practice. One of early texts that we did 20 years ago as a start in translation, in practical translation, was rendering three pepper, I remember the title even of the text, three pepper salad, and I used it in the textbook. Three pepper salad. And it was a legitimate problem for us with a group of students because on the list of ingredients there was feta. And I asked, 10 students in the group, nobody knew what feta was 20 years ago, and it's true. So the particular changes, because we would not have feta, but we would have something else. Like a few years ago, 3 years ago, we wondered about what sustainability is. And now it's no longer a problem. So the
It's good.
the problem as such remains the same. We have a need for a synonym because we do not have an item in our reality. So the general problem stays the same, but you swap the components, so to speak.
So this, in other words, strategies do not change, but procedures do. Can you say so?
I'm very hesitant in making very strong opinions like that. So, and it's always safer to consider translation problems in their context. Saying any universal truths like that is always dangerous, because we may find a case in which it's not pertinent.
Right.
So, and that's why I talk a lot about, and I believe in the relevance of incorporating sociology into translation. Looking at all the actors involved and all the factors that are present in our contemporary or ancient scriptorium. If there are no more questions, thank you very much for listening and attending the lecture. And see you at other Chair for Translation and Intercultural Communication lectures. Thank you.
Zostaniecie jeszcze chwilę, to powiemy, jakie będą następne wykłady.